Everyone to this session on data stewardship for people and society. I'm Valentina Pavel, a legal researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute, a UK-based research and deliberative body with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And today I'm excited to bring this conversation to you together with an excellent lineup of speakers to discuss how can data stewardship can help do good with data. But before we start, I do have some housekeeping rules. So this session is recorded and will be available on the My Data conference website. If you want to stay anonymous, you know what you have to do. We'd love to have a lively and interactive session, and you can post your comments and questions all throughout the session. Hannah, our communications manager, is here with me to help monitor the chat discussion. But I would really appreciate if you could please post your questions to Slido. You can go to slido.com and use the code 24280. I'm going to paste this in the chat so it's easier for you. And you can send and upvote questions there. And it'd be super helpful if you could indicate if your question is specifically addressed to one of the speakers. This discussion is open to the outside world, so please share whatever information is relevant to you. And please be kind if you attribute remarks to any of the speakers. If you share on Twitter, please tag us with at Ada Lovelace Inst, INST, and use the hashtag data stewardship and of course, my data online 2020. So before introducing you to our speakers, I'd actually like to get a sense from you. So what does doing good with data mean to you? It would be great if you could add your answer in the Slido poll using the event code 24280. So this is I know this is a very broad question, and feel free to interpret it any way you want. And if you need some inspiration, I actually prepared to share this article by my colleague Aidan Pepin, who has been driving most of this work at Ada. I'm going to post it now in the chat. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat. My attention span is really stretched at this moment. So I hope you can access the poll and type your question. I see one there now, so good that it's work. Just had to check this. So I'll just leave the poll running for a few more minutes. But I have to be honest though, I hope that at least one answer is going to mention something about responsible data governance, because today we want to critically engage with the concept of data stewardship. We want to hear your experience with doing good with data and how can data stewardship help. So the aim of this session is to build a better understanding of the data stewardship landscape, to introduce a range of viewpoints, to see what initiatives exist in this space, and we'll share a range of research on frameworks and models for governing data in a way which is human and society centered. And finally, we want to discuss how ideas can be put into practice. And now let me introduce you to our speakers. To help us navigate this topic, we have Astha Kapoor. She's a co-founder of the Aapti Institute. Hi, Astha. We have Kasia Odrozek. She's the Insights Director at the Mozilla Foundation. We have Jessica Montgomery, Executive Director at Accelerate Program for Scientific Discovery at Cambridge University. And Javier Creus, he's the co-founder of Salus Coop. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for kindly accepting this invitation to join the panel. And knowing a little bit more about your work, I, for one, am very excited to learn more from you. So as I'll wait for the last poll answers, I'll actually turn to the speakers for a rapid fire question to break the ice. And after this, we will go deeper into the nuances of the topic, and we structure the discussion in three parts. The first one is around. Can you please mute your microphone if you're not talking? That'd be super helpful. Yeah, thanks. So I was saying that just a short recap of the discussion. The first part will be answering the question of what is data stewardship. The second part is going to talk about how can data stewardship help do good with data, and then the third part is going to be around what action is needed. And for each part, we will have a short intervention from the panelists, followed by Q&A. But depending on your questions, I'm happy to adapt the discussion to whatever is interesting and relevant to the participants. Okay, so enough talking from my part, and here we go. Astha, Kasia, Jessica, and Javier, are you ready? What does data stewardship mean to you? Why are we talking about this? Why is it important, and what are we trying to achieve? So it'd be great to keep this very short and smooth. What's your, let's say, like 1 minute pitch of for data stewardship? Yeah, Astha, if you want to go first.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So, I mean, in the context of the digital economy, I think that we're all realizing that the data is either concentrated in the hands of a few companies, or it's being extracted from individual lives increasingly. And we don't, as people, as groups, as communities, as society at large, don't necessarily benefit from the value of this data adequately. And the question of value is something that we can come back to. But in that context, what data stewardship means is the ability to unlock this value of data for people in a way that, you know, it's in a rights preserving manner, in a way that people can participate in decisions around their data, in a way that they can influence these decisions around data, and so that governance of data is not entirely top down, but it involves people. And I think that the reason we're thinking about it is because there's a growing realization that we're actually just very, very small, insignificant parts of the digital economy, and that we need to find ways of governing data that, you know, give us more agential rights over data. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, thanks, Astha. Kasia, do you want to share your 1 minute pitch?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good very, very morning, wherever you are. I'm very delighted to be here as well. So my pitch, I think that we enter a time when more and more people are realizing that data not only needs to be protected, but also has this immense potential to have value for individuals, for groups, for society, or maybe even for our planet. And I think we used to hear that it has value for big tech and that we're being exploited and mined, that there is this power asymmetry, but we haven't, or we're doing now, making the connection that we could actually take this power back in the form of information and even leverage the data for benefits, even if it's monetary or not, that's a discussion but we can also leverage for activism, for advocacy, for research, and for community rights. And I'm especially also thinking about those communities who've been systemically disadvantaged economically or otherwise. So I think this understanding is sinking in, and this spurs innovation. And I think this is being picked up by those communities who see these chances, but also by slowly by some tech founders who see a chance for a new kind of demand here. And I think with this year, especially with COVID-19, it also showed us how far we've come in considering data as a key to solving big problems, for better or worse, of course. And I think we finally see the value of data in aggregate as well, and the need for claiming this value collectively and on our terms. And I think this is where the data stewardship concept comes in for me, that we need this trusted mechanism or entities that help communities get this empowerment data can give them, align on purpose, and also help with responsible ethical data governance. And just to close, to channel Mozilla here, I think it's especially important that in times when we see artificial intelligence development exploding and showing up in our daily lives, we know AI runs on data. And so it's imperative that the owners of data, us, get a seat at the table and get involved in data governance before or and after it gets processed by an algorithm. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kasia. If you already have some questions in mind, please feel free to use Slido, or if it's easier, the chat function in Zoom. But now I'd like to invite Jessica for her 1-minute pitch on why does data stewardship, what does it mean and why is it important? Jessica?
Thanks, Valentina. So we've talked for a little while about data governance, and we can think about data governance as the full suite of regulations, frameworks, professional standards, behaviors, technologies that can inform how we use data and how we manage data. And if we think about governance in those broad terms, we can think about stewardship as the action by which different stakeholders deploy those methods to use data for a particular purpose. And this idea of data stewardship isn't new. We've been using data for a long time to inform decision-making by individuals, governments, organizations. But as Astha was saying, the thing that has changed and why we're revisiting this now is that over the last 10 years, the data environment has changed. As individuals, we're producing more data from a greater variety of sources and activities. And technologies like AI are enabling us to use that data in different ways. And so this is what demands we think again about how we steward the data we're creating, both to realize the value that's potential there to achieve these wonderful public benefits, like in the COVID-19 outbreak, as Kasia was talking about, but also to manage the vulnerabilities that arise as a result of data use, whether that's a widening in power asymmetries in society or particular harms to already marginalized communities.
Thank you, Jessica. And Javier.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. The way we see data stewardship at Salus Coop is we need new institutions. When the world changes and we pass from fossil energized to data, and the centralization of data, be it commercial or institutional government, has the temptation of control, because you can modify people's opinions and people's behaviors through data. No, you have to put data in favor of society. And we don't have the institutions, we don't have the trade unions, we don't have the think tanks. We are the emergent points of this, of the people who take care not only of my data, but of our data, and how to unleash the collective power for good of our collective data. And I believe that's what we need. We need new institutions. We need, and I believe that in digital, rights are not only expressed, but they're instrumented. So we need new architectures, and I believe that my data is very good, distributed personal repositories, new sort of licenses, data licenses, which help stewardship packages, stewardships in conditions established by citizens for sharing data. I believe that data stewardship is promoting all these new institutions, architectures, and rules that may encourage and unleash the power of collective data and the management of self-data.
Thank you, Javier. And I'll put a bookmark to come back to describing a little bit more about the licensing mechanism that you use, and also I'll invite Jessica a little bit later to share more on the legal mechanisms around data stewardship. But I just had a look in the meantime at the poll results, and I have to say a lot of the answers are very close to the way that I see the picture. And it's super true that data stewardship is or should be respecting the values of those who provide the data and who will be affected by the outcome of the data analysis. It has to put citizens and people back in control, and the data has to be used for a common good. Now, another answer rightly points out that there are a lot of gray areas, and it really depends what is considered good and who defines it, and who gets to decide. And hopefully we'll see how the discussion evolves today, and if we can draw some conclusions around that. But just to sum up, the way I see it, and the way that I also heard it from our speakers, is that data stewardship is an overarching notion, which is trying to respond to the question, what data practices can facilitate the use of data for social good while empowering and protecting individuals. And of course, sorry, the intention is to build true agency and control over data. So as we can see from these short interventions from our speakers, data stewardship seems to be a very exciting and growing landscape. And there are lots of novel ways to govern data for the good of society, and that's what I would like the speakers to come in on today. Just to mention shortly, some consider data stewardship as an overarching concept, which describes the different types of approaches and values used to design new models for data governance. And others suggest more concrete descriptions of what is a data steward's role or function. So I know, Astha, you've been doing some more deep dive into both these angles. So I'm going to invite you to tell us maybe a little bit more about how this concept emerged. Why do we need it? And it'd be great if you could highlight the different understandings and critiques and also concerns around it, and share what are the different data governance models and what are they trying to receive. In the meantime, I'm also going to share in the chat the link to one initiative that Astha is also involved in. It's called the Data Economy Lab. And you will find there also a Data Stewardship Explorer, which is a very useful tool, and more reading resources. And also a link to a taxonomy report that Astha and the Aapti Institute did. So while I'll post this in the chat, Astha, it'd be great to hear more of your reflections.
Yeah, thanks so much, Valentina. As Valentina mentioned, we're building the Data Economy Lab out of the Aapti Institute to examine exactly this, is that, there are all of these inequities in the data economy, and what is the role of stewardship, which is, as everyone said, this governance framework, a way of thinking about how we can increase access to data while making sure that the rights of people are safeguarded, making sure that, as Valentina said, that people have a seat on the table. So the reason this becomes important, along with everything that was said, is that, we have so far been thinking about data from a protection lens, as Kasia mentioned as well. It has largely been about how do we prevent harm? How do we make sure that people can protect themselves against the possible harms that come from data breaches, lack of security, etc.? And a lot of this has been focused on individuals. How can individuals protect themselves against harm? Because what the data economy has done has atomized our experiences online, has isolated us, and which in some part is true, because a lot of it is very personal and sensitive data that we generate online. But also now increasingly there's a realization that it's not just about me, that my data also represents other, women of color, other Indian women, that there is a relational aspect both to the value of data as well as the harms caused by it. And therefore what we are realizing increasingly is that there is the limitations of the individual view are coming to bear. And again, the second realization is, as we've also said, is that there is value. So data is not just about data protection, which is what existing regulation talks about, but about also unlocking that value for a broader group of people. So thinking of data as a resource, which has concerns about thinking of it as property, etc., and the way that we regulate it. But fundamentally, data is something that carries value, not just for the companies that collect it and use it and analyze it, but also for communities. That Kasia mentioned, it can be used for research, it can be used for better management of cities, it can be used for environmental management. So there is a huge amount of value to this data. And then finally, to say also that individuals, as we negotiate in the data economy, are we able to do so in any kind of meaningful way? Are we able to get redressal for how our data is being used and mismanaged? Are we able to challenge questions like, everybody knows the big Cambridge Analytica situation. In cases like this, are we able to get redressal adequately? And as anybody who's tried to raise a complaint on any platform, there's almost no redressal, there's no transparency, there's no accountability of platforms. So all of this to say is that we're slowly coming to a breaking point in the context of the digital economy, which makes the case for data stewardship, at least to me, fairly automatically, because data stewardship does a few things. One is it thinks of data governance not just as an individual mechanism, but something that requires different kinds of intermediaries. And these intermediaries, and we'll come to that, come in different shapes and forms for different purposes. But the fact that we need intermediaries to help us navigate the digital ecosystem. The second is also recognizing that there is power in a collective idea of negotiating, that because our data is not just about us, because there is value that is attached to it that belongs to a community of people, the negotiation around it, the unlocking around it also should come through a community mechanism. And then finally, this whole question of value, that this data that we generate, we should benefit from. So based on all of this, we think that stewardship is a mechanism. Now, stewardship, like I said, comes in different shapes and forms. You can have mechanisms of stewardship that only belong at the individual level. And we're seeing that. And of course, my data, is a space for these kinds of innovations where you have personal data stores that give individuals power over their data, but through an intermediary, you get to control it better. You get insights into what your data is. And then if you so choose to use it for societal value, for personal economic value, you can do that. So there are individual intermediaries, which is a new kind of data governance. The second, which I think is the collective intermediaries, which come in the form of data cooperatives like Salus, Coop, such as where groups or members who are united by a certain common intent can come together to aggregate their data rights, to use their data in a way that is valuable. So this can be in the context of using data for research, like in the case of Salus, Coop, or using data to give, say, for instance, groups of drivers or workers better insights into their data to be able to negotiate with technology platforms better. And then finally, I think the third type of data governance happens for societal value, which is, you have these third parties that work to aggregate, to anonymize, to make sure that data can be shared for societal purposes. So some of this is being done, outside of in cities where data is collected, anonymized, aggregated, but can be used for solving municipal issues, sewage management, traffic, safety, etc. And then you have stewards who work through data in that level. So I think these are the three different levels at which data governance can happen through stewardship. And to understand what different models are trying to achieve, like I said, it can be for individual empowerment, such as in the case of individual intermediaries like personal data stores. It can be for community value, so this value can be decided by the community, but it can be for better enfranchisement, it can be for better negotiation, and then third is finally for societal value. And not to say that individual or community value does not lead to societal value, but just to draw some distinctions within these three tiers. And like I said, there are different models for each of these purposes. Now, what we need to understand better in this context is where it works, what models work in what context, what types of governance, how does decision making happen when you're talking about individual models versus collective models. How do we think about the idea of the collective, which a lot of this thinking is hinged on? What is a collective in the context of data? How do you define collectives when you don't have shared experiences? Are you in a Facebook group? Is that your collective? Versus if you're a Lyft driver, is that your collective? And also so data is complex, and as a result of that, its governance mechanisms are complex. But I'm really glad that we're beginning to realize that and not thinking of it just as this monolith of protection, of security, of questions of harm, but also thinking about it from the perspective of empowerment, from the perspective of decision making, from a perspective of making sure that people have greater agency over data. And that is what stewardship does. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Astha. This was excellent. But I do have to come on one of your points, especially around property rights and empowering people that way, because I do think there are some limits that we have to draw. That would be one of my personal limits. But yeah, if there's interest from the participants, we can talk a little bit more about monetization and commodification of data, because that's one of my favorite topics. But now, Kasia, you're leading the data stewardship and data future landscape analysis at Mozilla Foundation. And from what I understand, this the aim of this project is to inform an upcoming data futures lab. So can you please tell us a little bit more about that? And it'd be great to hear from you now, going one level deeper into the topic. What are the different data stewardship initiatives in this field? What work has been done? It'd be great to get a sense from you. How does the data stewardship landscape look like today? And I'll post the link to the data futures work that you've been doing in the chat.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and Astha, thank you for this overview. So we at Mozilla Foundation, my team has been doing some research this year to inform, as Valentina said, the launch of so-called Data Futures Lab. In the coming year, that will be funding and convening people involved in the field and trying to advance it. And first, of course, like understand it and figure out what's the right direction forward. And as part of this research, the research was pre-formed. We also looked at different models to understand the definitions, because it's a really confusing field first time you get into it. We looked at what can go wrong. We did an analysis. And then finally, we did also gather 110 examples of initiatives, of companies, of NGOs who are doing something that it appeared to us looks like it might fit the pretty broad definition of data stewardship. And then later we started talking about it as alternative data governance mechanism. So I'm happy to give you an overview of what came out of this kind of like practical look at the industry to complement what Astha said. And I will try to share my screen because I have 4 slides. I hope, because there are some graphs and so on. Can you see it now? Yeah. All right, great. So as I said, we assembled a database of 110 examples, and the many theoretical models that Astha described, and we also researched, they carry over into practice. But we definitely saw that we're still at the beginning of figuring out what works for whom and with what data governance approach. And we see that many initiatives today rethink data in agriculture and health, on mobility, but you cannot yet say that they constitute a credible challenge to the surveillance economy, at least yet. But we definitely see that the technology to manage personal data or distribute benefits from data sets might offer a glimpse of the future. What we definitely see is the creativity in the field. But in order to gather this database, we also needed to first understand like how to approach this and how to define it beyond the general line. So at Mozilla, we approach it from the empowerment angle. We try to define it across these 3 criteria that you see here on the screen. And our kind of guiding light is that we're looking at initiatives and projects and products that are kind of in opposition to what Facebook is doing, so what the big tech is doing. So we looked at products that either shift agency between data collectors, data subjects, and other beneficiaries in a meaningful way, and they share benefits of data between various parties rather than just concentrating most of the value within a single organization, it's like, for example, Facebook does, or either manage data in ways that represent multiple interests. So data collectors, data subjects, or affected individuals and communities. And that helped us come up with this pretty broad data base. And here, I will show you some stats of like what came out of the database in aggregate. But here I thought I would talk about a couple of examples also that showcase maybe what you can find in the database. So the first example, it's a driver's seat. That's kind of like almost like a very like poster boy of the field, so to say, because it fits so nicely and it really exemplifies so nicely of many aspects that are important here. There's a cooperative in the US of on-demand drivers who drive for Uber, for Lyft, or for any other drive shares. And they gather their own combined driving data in an app to gain insights that are usually kept secret by employers like Uber. So there is this shift of agency happening here. And then driver seat sells the mobility data to city agencies, for example, to inform better urban planning and so on, but also offers the insight of this data in aggregate to the drivers themselves, so they can see, for example, how much they earn every day, how much of it is with the net earning, or like how they moved around the city. So a lot of like insights that Uber, for example, Uber doesn't offer to them, they get to see thanks to driver seat. And then, of course, whenever they make profit with selling the data to, for example, city governments, because it's a cooperative, they share the benefits with the drivers. Another example here is Culture.io. That's an example of a marketplace designed by and primarily for the Black community, and it allows users to upload or connect any streaming account they have to their culture account and get paid for the data, something that Valentina doesn't like. But here we wanted to look at all the examples to see what's happening in the field at large. The Culture.io, they help co-create the data license where the user remains the owner of the data. User can delete the data wherever they want, but for example, they can exclude at the moment certain buyers from buying. So of course, not everything is figured out yet. Then we have an example of Glimpse protocol. That's something entirely different. That's a protocol, a company B2B that connects companies to consumers while respecting the privacy of individuals as required by, for example, GDPR or CCPA regulation in the US. And that platform enables brands to reach precise audiences in the advertising industry without collecting their data while complying with data privacy regulation. And here, the users, whenever they interact with this advertising Glimpse protocol, this network online, the data is being collected, but it's very transparent to them. They can delete it at any moment without even contacting contacting my data. So there is this shift in agency and in the representation of interest happening here. And then we also have Me Data, which is a Swiss nonprofit cooperative, a data platform that acts as a trustee and lets citizens choose which data to share with startup and research groups. They are currently focusing on health data. I think that's a pretty similar to Salus, Coop, so I will not talk more about it because Javi will probably exemplify this example a little bit more. So these are a couple of concrete examples, but also I wanted to show you what we saw when we look at the database in aggregate. And of course, this is not a comprehensive look at the whole field, but I think it shows some trends still. So by looking at the 110 examples, we noted that initiatives in the health and technology sector were the most common in our database. In the health sector, initiatives often aim to benefit the general public or particular communities, while initiatives that we place in the technology sector tend to aim to benefit individuals. And for-profit companies are most common in the technology sector, but otherwise relatively uncommon compared to nonprofit. So there's a lot of nonprofit action going on in this field, and kind of like the startups and founders are like slowly catching up to this opportunity. Next one, initiatives that aim to benefit individuals tend to offer control over personal data. So for example, such as Jumbo Privacy, I don't know, it's an app that helps you control how much automatically change your settings of Facebook or delete your data logged into Google and so on. So these ones that benefit individuals are more focused on the individual. They offer control over personal data, while initiatives that aim to benefit particular groups or communities, they are mostly often focused on making data more available or accessible to them, to these communities or to researchers, but they don't necessarily always offer control. And finally, regarding how global this phenomenon is, we worked with 7 researchers who are in different regions of the world who spoke the local languages, just to make sure that we kind of investigate like where this kind of language is present or when this kind of innovation is happening. And we found that maybe unsurprisingly, most of the initiatives stem from North America and Europe, and to some extent India. And there are certainly examples all over the world, but there is definitely a regional imbalance. And we also found that the most frequent terms used in English to describe data governance are not commonly known or neither easily translated nor widely circulated as solutions to problems. And we thought, while talking to our regional researchers and about their assumptions, why is it so, we concluded that it might also depend on a variety of additional contextual factors, including, is there a data privacy regulation in the region? Is there a significant data economy, data markets, how mature they are there traditions of cooperatives or other domains in the region? Or yes, of course, what funding exists for experimentation? So this was the first part of our research. We, while doing this one, we of course looked also at the supporting entities, who supports all of this, the whole ecosystem, funders, thought leaders, communities, and so-called hybrid organizations that move this forward, but also support others by developing technology such as My Data or, for example, BrightHive in the US. But this is the subject of our next research that we'll be publishing in February. Sorry, I took a bit longer, I think.
No worries, Kasia. This was super informative, and it's great to have the picture better painted. I really appreciated that. We will turn to questions after Jessica and Javier have the chance to give their short intervention as well. But thank you already for posting your question in the chat or on Slide or whatever is easier for you. And now, Jessica, so for example, Kasia mentioned Me Data. And I do have the sense that it's probably a little bit different than Salus Coop. Javier, I'm also going to ask you this question later. And I think me data, well, I'm going to ask Jessica for her opinion if it's set up as a data trust or not, and what are the different nuances around data trusts. Because she's involved in an initiative called the Data Trust Initiative, and it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and also help us understand a little bit more around the different legal mechanisms that can be applicable to data stewardship, potentially with some of their advantages and disadvantages. And I know your work focuses a lot on data trust and what role does trust law or fiduciary responsibilities play in data sharing frameworks, but it'd be super helpful to expand a little bit the array of legal mechanisms that we have at hand. So Jessica, it'd be great to hear your reflections.
Thanks, Valentina. So as we've heard a little bit already this morning, current legislative frameworks set out a constellation or maybe a forest of data rights and responsibilities. And the challenge for data stewardship is to join the dots between these and connect the desire we have to share data for individual or community benefit with concerns we have about how to manage the harms that can arise as a result of data misuse. And there's lots of different mechanisms through which we can try and achieve this goal. There are technologies that can be used to manage data access or to provide pathways for auditing. There are professional norms and standards that influence how organizations use data or set the tone for how individuals interact with data. And then there are legal mechanisms that can be used to assign those rights and responsibilities associated with different types of data to different actors and create mechanisms for accountability or redress. And so data sharing activities to date have tended to adopt approaches to data stewardship that are based on contract or corporate law. So many of the data sharing arrangements we enter into on a daily basis, like if you joined early, you would have heard Valentina talking about having to accept some cookies onto her machine to access services. That type of thing is based on consenting to data sharing and data use in a kind of contractual way. We've also got data co-ops that have been set up on a contractual basis or through corporate law that try and inject an element of collective decision-making in defined ways, or data commons that operate similarly and try and pool data resources to enable data access. And these mechanisms have been really successful in some ways. They've enabled rapid business growth, they've enabled individuals to secure certain benefits for themselves or their communities, and they've been used to promote data use for civic purposes or public policy. What those mechanisms haven't enabled us to do so effectively is really manage some of the vulnerabilities associated with data use, or to really empower individuals and communities to influence how data about them is used. So a lot of these interactions are still based on a kind of engage or walk away type basis, and there isn't much scope for individuals or groups to go into contract negotiations and redefine the terms of data use. And so to fill this gap, data trusts have been emerging as a new legal model for data stewardship. In the UK context, these use the framework of trust law to create a legal structure in which individuals can pool their data into an organisation, a trust, in which a trustee is then tasked with taking decisions about that data use or how to exercise those data rights on behalf of the trust beneficiaries. And the idea behind this is that by pooling data rights in a trust, the trustee can act as an independent intermediary in negotiations about data use and harness that collective aspect that Astha was talking about earlier to be more effective in negotiations with people wanting to use data than any individual alone could be. Now, there's been an awful lot of excitement about data trusts in policy and research communities over recent years. The term itself appears in a whole range of different national data strategies. But with this popularity come questions about kind of what are we really talking about? And when we're talking about data trust, what are the practical strategies for implementation? How would we design and implement a data trust? So that leads us into questions about, okay, so what are we really talking about in the core features of a trust? What do we really mean by kind of shifting agency or sharing benefits? How can we connect that to practical implementation strategies? How would a trust operate? How would we ensure trusts were accessible to a wide range of communities? What would be the role of trustees? What action could be taken to hold trustees to account if they were failing in their duties? It's a potentially really difficult and challenging role, and most charities already face difficulties recruiting trustees to their board. So how are we going to create that pool of skilled professionals who are going to be willing to act as data trustees? And then how do we make these trusts sustainable? What's the business model? And how does that business model interact with the incentive to use data in different ways and to monetize data in different ways? And I said in the UK, trust law is a framework. Well, okay, in many civil law jurisdictions, trust law isn't available. So what are the equivalent legal mechanisms that can fulfill those core functions? So trusts are this kind of promising mechanism to beginning to offer a vehicle for collective action, but there's an awful lot more to still be worked out to take trusts to the next level and to implement them in practice. And it's that gap where some new work we're doing at Cambridge called the Data Trusts Initiative is trying to take action. So funding research and pilot projects that can work through these issues in tangible use cases.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I think we will go back perhaps to some of the points on legal mechanisms if there's interest to dive a little bit deeper into that. But now, Javier, I'd like to invite you to share the on-the-ground perspective and help us uncover the realities of alternative data governance models. And it'd be great to hear from you about your practical experience with setting up a data cooperative, and please tell us more about the impact that you want to create with your initiative. How did you design your governance model? If there were any options that you initially analyzed, and what were the hurdles or the barriers that you encountered and the lessons learned?
Okay, thank you so much, Valentina. So we started Salus Data Coop 4 years ago among 10 people who were concerned about how data for health research was obtained. It is difficult to obtain, and not everyone can obtain it. It demands effort and time and money, very much time. So alternatives to commercial research are sometimes not attended. And on the other hand, citizens don't have power to manage collectively their data, as Jessica was explaining so well. So we decided to create Salus Coop, and it's a citizen data cooperative for health research. And we say health research because, as we see now in COVID times, research and health has to do 10% with genetics, 20% with clinics, 30% socioeconomics. There are 10 years difference life expectancy within the same city, in different neighborhoods of the same city, and 40% lifestyle. Do you exercise or you not? Do you have friends or you not? Do you smoke or not? No, all this part of data is unconsidered because there's much more investment in products, vaccines, antibiotics than it is in processes, living where air has good quality, or living near to a park, and everything, all this is health. So we set up this cooperative. We work first with all the constituencies, the doctors and the patients and the nurses and research institutions in the mammal cancer disease. And we learned that citizen collective management of data was better than individual management of data, commercial management of data, or public management of data. So we went on. Next step, we put up a machine on the internet that would create scenarios for people sharing data. It's an experiment called 3M, where we offer people, if commercial institutions asks for your skin data to research on hair health, keeps results from themselves, would you share your data or not? And then a new scenario, if a public institution would like to study arthrosis and demands how much would you walk every day and will publish openly results, would you or would you not share your data? We had 8,000 responses to that questionnaire, to that scenarios, and we discovered that 87% of people would share their data under 5 conditions. And we thought that it was time to pack all these 5 conditions into a license, such as Creative Commons did the job to break copyright. We believe we need a new sort of licenses that break the code of data, which is much more complex. So our data license, Commons Good from Salus, has these 5 points. I will donate my data for non-profit institutions who do research on health, not aesthetical things or things that are not documented as health, that share results openly, kind of share alike, like in Wikipedia, which anonymize my data as far as it can, and where I can change my settings at any time. And this license is already being used by citizen science experiments all over Europe and allows us to choose to pick research institutions who want to do research and signed in these conditions, in this license, which we citizens have established, and relation these research projects with citizens, with donors willing to donate their data for that. And we're launching in April. Our governance so far has been mainly the founders. No, we are 18 founders right now. We will distinguish in the future between data donors and people who want to be actively involved in the governance of the cooperative. We'll probably include other cooperatives within governance, but not, for example, research institutions, because we thought we can have some other constituency to talk with them. So that would be what we do.
Thank you, Javier. That was super useful, and it's great to learn more from your experience. And when it comes to the question on how does decision making look like at Salus Coop, I'm gonna do a short presentation of some principles and then turn back to you to see if the framework that we've been working on at the Ada Lovelace Institute would be useful to your further plans. Okay, so we have a very good question in the chat, and now I'm going to open up the floor for the Q&A. But the question that caught my attention was, does the individual have right to dissent over use of her or his data by the community? So I'm not sure if this is addressed to all of the speakers or if anybody wants to jump in on this. But it'd be great to see what's your understanding around the different control mechanisms and decision making that needs to take place in the context of data stewardship. Any takers?
I might jump in there for a first go, and then perhaps others can intervene. So there are different ways of looking at this question. One is when we're thinking about the long-term development of data trusts, we're really looking for an ecosystem of different trusts. And the terms of each of those would reflect different values, aspirations, different attitudes to risk. So an individual should, in theory, be able to shop around and to move to a trust that best fits their aspirations and their concerns around data use. The other way of addressing that question is to think about the forms of participatory decision-making that might be embedded within the trust. And there's a lot of lessons on how to do this from experiences with existing cooperatives, but you can have different forms of participation, some of which are kind of very highly engaging and require a high level of attention, and others of which might be lighter touch.
Thanks, Jessica. Does anybody else want to
can I
share
just
thoughts?
yeah, to add to what Jessica said too, and also to just agree with Jessica, I think that there is we need to design governance mechanisms that allow people to participate in decision making at different levels. There's people who want to be more involved will be involved in all sorts of decision making versus people who just want and the intermediary or the trust or the cooperative to make decisions on their behalf, and also give their preferences. So for instance, I may want my data to be used for certain kinds of research, but not want it to be used for other purposes, etc. So those preferences, and also making sure that consent is given in a granular, revocable manner is also, I think, critical to make sure that individual and community interests don't always come in conflict. As Jessica mentioned, there are interesting ways of making sure that it's participative decision making, and also making sure that to be done in ways. So quadratic voting is something that keeps coming up, where people vote on preferences, etc., which is a complex system to engage in. But I think that that's something that could be possible. And I also think that there are questions beyond just individual and community. I think that there are also questions about how communities engage with each other, what happens when the interests overlap. And those are questions also that we don't necessarily have answers to. And the other concern, obviously, is that we don't want models of data stewardship to be captured by majoritarianism, which is also what is, the folly of democracies in a certain way. So those are all questions that we need to think about as we embed governance mechanisms in these stewards more intrinsically. And I think that, which I suppose we'll come to eventually, is that that's why we need more pilots. We need more innovations like Salus, Coop on the ground to actually, tinker around with some of these questions.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Astha. There's also a question to both Jessica and Javier. How do you manage disparate format of data coming from different data sources when you pull them within your data trust? Basically, the issue of interoperability. And I guess the question is not only specifically to data trusts under the trust law, but maybe data trust more generally, I would say. Jessica, do you want to go first?
So I suspect Javier will have more to say on how you actually work through some of these issues of interoperability in practice. I might just start with the idea of data trust from a legal perspective is that you have to have a right that you can hold in trust. So it's having that right that really matters in as much as it relates to data. The data itself may or may not be held in trust. So you can imagine different forms of data trusts that might hold different types of asset. It's not necessarily a given that it would have to hold the data itself. And that kind of gets you around some of those issues of interoperability. But I'll hand over to Javier for a fuller answer there.
I believe it's a very good question. Thank you so much. And for the launch, we're going for the quick wins on data. And quick wins for medical research is, on the one hand, questionnaires that can be used under the license, the conditions of our license, and information data that it's already on mobile. Steps, sleeping, Apple Fit, Google Health, or Apple Health and Google Fit. No, those are quick wins. Because we've discovered through these 4 years, we've been doing experiments to see whether we as a cooperative could represent you within the health administration and ask for your health record, no? And they're providing us, they're recognizing our juridical entity to do so, to represent the citizen in front of institutions and ask for data, no, with a signed document. But the process is still very manual. So accessing, for the moment being, accessing clinical data, it's a one-by-one step. We cannot scale that. We're talking with the government and with clinical institutions and so on. So to be short, we're starting with the quick wins. Already standardized data on mobiles and all sorts of apps on the one hand, which tell a lot about lifestyle and tell a lot about socioeconomics, no? And they complement genetical and clinical data for research on the one hand, and second, through questionnaires, which is already very structured data.
Okay, thanks, Javier. That was very clear. Now, I remember there was a question enumerating the different types of data governance model, like data commons, data cooperatives, data trust, data stewardship. It's like it's overwhelming to see this entire enumeration, and there's more. There's also a data box project, and I'm going to share the link to that as well. But now I'd like to invite you to maybe take a step back and as we've heard about the various nuances and understandings around data stewardship and how the entire field it is blossoming, I think there's also an utility in looking at the different framings and the different kinds of principles and practices that can help shape the use of data for social good. So I know the My Data community is very pragmatic and very, very hands-on oriented. But as new models of data governance are put forward, I think it's important for us to ask what principles shape data stewardship for good data governance. And I'd like to introduce some of the initial work that we've been doing at the Ada Lovelace Institute. You'll see in the Kiko chat and Kiko platform, and I'm also going to post in the chat a link to a framing and some design principles that we published a few months ago. And it is basically taking Elinor Ostrom's principles for governing the commons and trying to see how they apply to data and to data stewardship. So building on that, we adapted Elinor's Ostrom and see how they translate. And this produced a set of 23 possible design principles for data stewardship. Yeah, I'll post the link now so you can explore. It's also in the Kiko chat, embedded in the Kiko chat platform. I'm not going to go into detail for all of the principles. There are 8 in total, and I'm sure some of them are going to be already familiar to you. For example, there need to be clear boundaries and rules about who is entitled to access what. Of course, there needs to be participatory decision making, collective choice arrangements. As we've also heard from our speakers, there needs to be clear monitoring in place, both internal and external. I think we don't see that happening in the landscape of initiatives so far, but it'd be great to have a sort of like a third-party independent auditor. And there need to be very clear enforcement rules with progressive sanctions, and a clear mechanism for conflict resolution, not only internally, but also externally. So this is a very, very brief and high-level overview of the principles. Please feel free to explore the spreadsheet that I shared. You will see in sheet number 2 the list of principles that I mentioned, and then a list of around 100 case studies, which we used in order to map Elinor Ostrom's principles against the data landscape. But in short, what we've learned from this work is that data stewardship is highly contextual. It's not fixed, and it can depend on a range of factors. It of course includes questions around what kind of data is being used for what purpose, who is using it, who's sharing, who's accessing the data, and how are the various actors in the ecosystem acting and operating. Because data stewardship describes a relationship, and it articulates the rights and responsibilities for each of the various actors involved in collecting, analyzing, and using the data. So now turning back to our speakers, I'm really curious to hear from Javier if, for example, you had this sort of framework available 4 years ago when you first started the Salus Coop. Would this have been useful? Would it have helped you to start a little bit faster with your initiative? What's your immediate reaction to something like this?
Well, I was looking at it, and I believe it would have been useful. We had to deduce all these principles by ourselves, no? Coming from the open data movements, and you realize that this is not about open data. It's not only about making data accessible. It's making the energy of data, giving direction to the energy of data, not only spreading it out, no, and giving intention to that. And we've been realizing step by step all these decisions to make. For example, whether everyone who's a data donor should as well become a member of the cooperative, even if they don't want, no? And seeing that you may intervene in society without necessarily having an active participation, and in that sense, trust is very important on the institution. We've had to make choices about our funding. No, our business model will be based, once we're on, in getting data for research centers in our own conditions, and we believe we can make a decent organization doing that at a fair cost for everyone. No, but it's been very difficult to pull the money during all these 4 years, no, to keep on research and building the tools. And we've got help from Mobile Foundation, from the Catalan government, but it's hard to make understand society that we come from a place where all the conversation was about between public and private, no, commercial or institutional and governments, and now we are three at the table. In the data economy, in the data society, we are three at the table, no? We've got states and institutions, we've got commercial and corporations, and we've got citizens. And the experiments we are all doing here is to see how can we structure this third actor we need in the data economy. So I believe that it would have been useful to have this guide, but there are a lot of hurdles because we are all trying to create something that didn't exist, which boundaries are not yet clear, and there are diversity as in any experimental era.
Thank you, Javier. And I also like to invite anyone who's interested to have a look at the framework, to give us that feedback, would be more than happy to see how this can be helpful in practice. If you want to start, for example, a data governance model or a data stewardship initiative, it'd be great to hear how can this work, how this work can be helpful, and how we can take it further. I see there's a comment around business models, and Javier, you also mentioned the financial difficulties. I know Kasia also mentioned she had a look at funders and who are the supporters in this field, and I'm sensing this is a topic of interest. So I was wondering whether any of you would like to come in with further details around this.
I can do it. We also wrote a short sort of paper just on the, again, principles for revenue models. And if I may, Valentina, also comment on the principles that you have for design principles. The list, I think that it's immensely helpful, but I also wanted to agree with Javier, which is that, you know, it's such a new space. We know so little about it, and so many of the models that we are all learning from, Mozilla, Ada, Aapti, we all did the sort of database approach where we looked at these models and tried to make sense of them. And I think that exactly the same conclusion as you, and is that, you know, it's different things, different models, different responses for different situations, and also recognizing that this field is very early. And then then the question becomes is that how do we define principles for something that is so, and how do we define principles at the right level, I think is also just an open question for us as well. On the business models, we tried to do similar things, is that we looked at what were the possible business models, where is stewardship, you know, being useful in what context. So we looked at it from three perspectives. One was from the perspective of data commons, the other from the perspective of data unions, and the third from the perspective of personal data stores. And we realized a few things. One is, of course, that we believe that stewards of any kind, and which is why you know, driver's seat is interesting, we don't think that they should be monetizing data, because there is an inherent conflict that develops over time, and that's something that we think should not be part of any kind of revenue model. We may change this based on further analysis of feasibility and sustainability, but I think as of right now, we think that that's fundamental to how stewards are structured. There is also, you know, that a lot of stewards are using insights, and so there's something to be said about that, but fundamentally, and we think that they should be paid, you know, the sustainability of the steward should come from the data principles or subjects that they represent, irrespective of the community that they represent. So, which is why we find the idea of union dues as seen, which is where the members of the cooperative or the members of the union pay the steward for their services, and that's what keeps the steward sustainable. And so that we thought was an interesting way of thinking about it, because, but then it also comes to the next level of question, is that it's, how do we really demonstrate the value of the steward at the moment? Because people will sign on because it's new and innovative, but how do you stay on as part of the steward? And I've heard from several models that are actually doing this, is that demonstrating value, making sure that people stay engaged is a concern. And I don't know if, Javier, you've had the same experience, but I think that demonstrating value to people so that they continue to use the services of a steward is something that we think is a concern and will play into the model, the business model over time.
I can just add something on the funder side. I mean, it's not that much on the business model, but in general, for an emerging field, just like we saw in the startup field, sometimes you just need to kickstart a field so they have the time to actually figure things out. And that's why I think this ecosystem of funders coming together here to allow for this time to see, to get things right, to get the right principles, just as Astha said, like monetization, yes or not, we were going to have to finally solve this debate with some kind of principles or maybe some kind of codification of this data ownership. Are the principles around this? Should that be contractual? Should there be like legal safeguards or not? All of this like needs to be figured out first. And I think while it's really healthy, as opposed to what happened in Silicon Valley, to start thinking about business model and sustainability from day one, I think we don't need to like demand like perfect solutions from day one, and we can like help the field to get there by experimentation. I think that's where the founder's value is. Yeah.
I just wanted to add on the return side that Asha mentioned. What we discovered through 3M with these scenarios for building the license is that main driver for citizens sharing data was that papers would be open, that results of research would be open. And that means that we have a very intelligent society that understands, no, in a very basic way, that I would share my data for collective benefit. And the way we are translating that into Salus Coop is that every time you share your data with a research project, when the research project is published, you'll receive a note. And you have your own kind of bank account where you have the data you shared and the studies that have been published using your data. No? And that's the way we establish this relationship.
That's cool, Javier. It sounds a bit also of a gamification model there, but definitely caught the attention. But yeah, speaking about culture, something connected to this that I just realized we haven't discussed about is the Data Governance Act proposed by the European Union just a few weeks ago, which introduces this concept of data altruism and tries to encourage data sharing. But it also does a couple of other things. For example, it tries to add more mechanisms for data intermediaries. And I was wondering, Jessica, if you'd like to share your reflections around the Data Governance Act, and if this framework would help us kind of move the discussion from principles to practice, and how do you see the policy landscape evolving?
Thanks, Valentina. So the Data Governance Act, it's kind of the next phase of the European Commission's efforts to boost the data economy in the EU by making data more accessible. That's fundamentally its goal. And in doing that, it is focusing specifically on what it calls data intermediaries, which, depending on how you read the text of the draft act, are either anybody that is involved in enabling data sharing, or organizations that are specifically engaged in the kind of act of transferring data between organizations and hosting data as an independent intermediary. And what that act is trying to do is set in place a governance framework for those intermediaries. So it's putting in place a range of kind of oversight mechanisms, institutional safeguards, and kind of basic requirements for how those intermediaries operate, with the aim of ensuring that anything that is registered in the EU as a data intermediary can be considered trustworthy. And there are interesting points of overlap with a lot of the things we've been talking about today. So there are requirements in there about how intermediaries can structure their business models and how they can make money off data. So the Act imposes a strict separation of services that are offered to enable data sharing and services that are monetizing data. So you have to have kind of structures in place in your organization to separate those functions so that the data intermediary is not making profit from its data sharing services. There are requirements in there around notification. So intermediaries should have to register with their competent national authorities. And that's about making sure that There are forms for redress. So when people have a complaint against a data intermediary, they can complain to their national authority, and then there may be court action that follows. So there are different forms of accountability built in there. And then there are some requirements in the Act about accessibility. So there are a few lines there about access to intermediary services having to be fair, transparent, and particularly around pricing, there needs to be structures in place to prevent discrimination. So there's lots in the Act that are picking up bits of what we've talked about today. And I think we're all waiting to see how that develops over the coming months as it heads into the European Parliament. It does also raise questions, for example, from a data trust perspective, about would a trust that does not itself handle data be classed as a data intermediary? What needs to be in place with regards to the mandatability or the transferability of data rights? There are comments in the Act about it not being possible to delegate your rights to a data co-op. So what does that mean for how data co-ops are functioning? What does that mean about the additional safeguards that might need to be in place there? So it also raises a lot of interesting questions for the field.
Thanks, Jessica, for this great overview. By the way, the Data Governance Act is in public consultation until the beginning of January. So if you do have comments, please share them with the European Commission, because I think this framework could really need to be shaped up a little bit better from my point of view. I see a very good question in the chat, which is kind of like dropping the bomb on the topic. I'm not sure how to handle this because we're not very far from the end of our session, but let's try to address it to the best we can. So the question is, to what extent do you think our reliance on data protection, individual at its heart, in fact prevents us from thinking about truly alternative data futures? It's a tough one, especially if you're coming from a privacy and data protection background like I am. So I'm happy to pass this to our speakers, whoever wants to tackle this.
The way we look at this is, I mean, the only way to you can work on that protection, but it's very difficult. No, there are intermediaries, there are ways to capture data. I believe the only way is to counterattack and create abundance of data there where you want it. Because what's happening now is that now there's abundance of data in commercial businesses, there's abundance of data on government institutions in all parts of the world, and there's a scarcity of data on the for good, social, you name it sector. No, if we're able to create equality of that abundance on all points of view, we are already counteracting this. We were in a conversation yesterday and we concluded that information asymmetry in the 21st century is what capital asymmetry was on the 20th century. So, I mean, on the one hand, we can try to restrict abundance on the commercial, on the control surveillance side. But on the other hand, with the same intensity, we have to generate abundance, on the for good economy. And I believe we have to do both things at the same time.
I would add to that if I said that it doesn't have to be either or, and it should never be either or. I think that's how that was the first step to fight for the data privacy and for protection. And now we have the regulations starting with GDPR and expanding all over the world. And that's how we used to talk about it. So now is the time to take the next steps and think like, so how can we, just as we said in the beginning of the session, so how can we benefit from the value of the data for the society and on a community level, while at the same time making sure that there are safeguards for keeping our data as protected as we want it to be, given, of course, that there is literacy around the opportunities and the challenges and the threats to our data. So I think there needs to be a paradigm, there needs to be a lot of education happening, and maybe some experimentation, maybe not the critical areas of the data, but somewhere like showcase, like what's the benefit, to start people could start clicking, okay, that actually we can do more, there is value to the data, and define it how it is, and so on, but do it all the time at the same level. Okay, but that's why I think the way we think about it, the agency part is so important there, the agency and accountability part, so that we don't let go of what we established already and what we achieved already in some parts of the world, at least.
If I may also add to that, I think that there's a sort of false distinction being made that data protection is for personal data and then data use and sharing is for non-personal data. And that's happening in the EU based on the recent DGA, and also in India where we've got a non-personal data committee report. And I think that distinction also needs to be challenged where, as Kasia said, I think that the question of agency of empowerment through data or for data needs to be built off the protection frameworks and not something that is instead or of the protection frameworks in both the EU as well as the India, sort of non-personal frameworks. There's a sense that, anonymization, if you consent to, at least in the context of India, if you consent to anonymization, then you automatically consent to share non-personal data, which is, it's problematic and it doesn't necessarily think about use and harm as adequately. But at the same time, I think that to jettison these individual frameworks of personal data protection is going to be problematic, because as Kasia said, we've all fought for these rights and these frameworks and, for this regulation, and any kind of empowerment work needs to come on top of it. And also just to sort of, register my discomfort at the sort of personal and non-personal data distinction that is increasingly being made in policy.
Just to comment on that, Astha, I'd also like to highlight the fact that, in my opinion at least, there's the fact that data protection is focused on individual rights does not mean it doesn't have a collective impact and collective benefit. And there's a paper by the previous European Data Protection Supervisor, Giovanni Buttarelli, who I think does a very good job in surfacing some of the ways in which data protection helps create social and collective impact. And I think there's not so much research into this topic. It's something that I'm also personally interested in, but we do need to keep this in mind. So we're a few minutes from the closing of our session. I'd like to maybe invite Jessica to share maybe one short final remark, if she wants to, and then we'll come to a close.
Thanks, Valentina. So gosh, final word. That's some pressure. Which is, I would just reiterate some of the things we've already called for, that a lot of these issues require us to begin to work through use cases and to develop pilot projects that can help us figure out how to make this move from principle to practice, that can help us figure out what the purpose of these different data stewardship models are. What are the institutional safeguards and mechanisms for accountability that need to be in place to match the needs of different circumstances? What do we really know about what different individuals and communities want from data governance, and how well do these different models map onto that? And then how can we make them sustainable in the long term? So really, to make progress, we're going to have to be working on all these fronts, and that's why we need a range of different pilot projects to be out there exploring how to make this happen.
That's a great summary and a wonderful note to close on. So I guess myself and all of the speakers are super available for any collaboration opportunities or for discussing this topic further. So thank you so much for joining us today and for all your questions and comments. And do reach out if you want to continue this conversation. And we'll stick around for a bit longer if you want to have some networking. Yeah, what can I say? It's a truly fascinating field, and I hope it needs all of us to make it right. So thank you very much for today, and see you in the next questions. Many thanks for the My Data conference organizers for their entire effort and for hosting this session. Thank you, Sile. Thank you, Caro. Thank you to our technical moderator and to all the My Data community members. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.